encompassing most towns actually across Victoria. We normally have a book display that relates to our theme. At the moment, because of our anniversary, we've got books set up in our cabinets in here relating to our history. But outside on the table, just as you came in, there are some books you can actually leaf through that relate to tonight's theme. And I think Jade said to me, all of them except perhaps one is available for loan.
Yeah.
So Jade and Eva will be capturing photographs and videos during today's event for our promotional purposes and YouTube recording and so on. But if you prefer not to be included, just let us know. I can easily accommodate that. So I'd now like to welcome Patrick more formally from the Victorian Office of the National Archives of Australia. And some of you might remember Patrick came and talked to us in June about some of those stories from the ASIO files, which was lovely. And Patrick's an archivist with over 20 years of experience in the field. He's also the author of various local history books and a winner of the Victorian Community History Award in 2020. So we're very pleased to welcome you back today to tell us all about an exodus from Vienna.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. It's always lovely to be back at the PMI, and I'm very proud to say I'm in the collection here in 2 or 3 works, which is really great. Before we get underway, I'd just like to introduce my colleague Andrew Griffin from the Victorian Office of the National Archives as well. Andrew, do you want to wave? So Andrew's come along. You've come out in force tonight. And as Judith said, I'm going to tell you the story of the Weiss family and their exodus from Vienna. So just at the outset, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and the custodians of the country upon which we're meeting, the Wurundjeri people, and I acknowledge their elders, past, present and emerging. And I do have to just let you know, content warning, that this presentation does contain historical images and themes that some people may find distressing. So the beginning of this presentation or project, one of the things that the team I managed until last week at the National Archives in North Melbourne does is handle reference inquiries from members of the public. And under the Archives Act, we provide access to records that are over 20 years old, subject to certain exemptions. And part of what the team does, including Andrew, who's one of our senior examiners, what they do is they have to examine the records before we release them to make sure there's nothing of any sensitivity or national security or commercial confidentiality in them. And usually after 20 years, there's not very much that's to be exempted. Anyway, just before lockdown in 2021, we were going through the access queue and this turned up in the queue. We have a series of records here in Melbourne, which are passports that were surrendered by non-British migrants when they arrived in Australia. And so this particular item in the collection, which is a German passport, came to my desk to be access examined. Now, there were no sensitivities or anything with the passage of so much time. But as I started going through the passport, it was quite interesting just to look at all of the visa stamps and things and thinking, gee, there's a story behind this passport, you know, because all of the stamps and where they had to go, you know, to get to Australia. And that sort of got me thinking, there's a story behind this record. And one of the things that I am very passionate about as an archivist is connecting the records with the stories and telling those stories, because archives at the end of the day are places of memory, not just dusty old records, they're places of memory. And this passport, in many respects for me, encapsulated people's innate desire for a better future for themselves and their families. It spoke of the ingenuity, the perseverance, the courage and resilience of people. It also, as we unfolded the story from the passport and other material, spoke of misfortunes, setbacks and mistakes, injustices, horrors, things that, you know, befell this family. And that, as I said, is what makes an archive a very powerful place of memory. They become portals in many respects to the past, shedding light on our families and our communities and our nation itself. So what I'm going to do tonight is introduce you to the Weiss family and the Vienna of the turn of the century, where they were living, then look at Australia's wartime refugee policy, their exodus, their journey, a little bit about their life in Australia, and just showcase some of the other Austrian Jewish legacies in particular in the National Archival Collection. So this is primarily the story of Max and Regine Weiss, and these are their passport photos from their passports in the collection. Interestingly, both of them were born in what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it was a marvellously multicultural empire. And Max and Regine were born in what was then Hungary, but today we know that area of the world as Slovakia. German was their native language, not Hungarian or Yiddish. And they were married in 1891. And that's Max and Regine in slightly older age in Austria. Now, Michael's Hungarian birth certificate, this actually is not in our collection, this has come from the family, is headed, and I don't know much Hungarian, but Izraelita would indicate this is a certificate specifically for Jewish people. So even at registration at birth, you know, there is this separation, you know, legally of Jewish people from other Hungarians. And it's a reminder that at the time when Michael was born, people of Jewish faith did not enjoy full citizenship rights in the Austrian Empire. That was something that was won only over time. Now, Regine was born in 1867, and she was born after the 1867 Ausgleich, the compromise, which created the dual Austro-Hungarian Empire. Until then, Hungary had been subject in many respects to Austria. And with that change in the constitution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Jewish people were actually accorded full citizenship. So on her birth certificate, which again comes from the family, there's no reference to Israelite at the top. Now, Max and Regine lived in Vienna. They were merchants, business people, and they actually had what was called a department store. One of their grandsons, who grew up in Melbourne but had originally been born in Vienna and spent his early school days there, said that when he was a child, the department store seemed very big. When he went back, you know, many years later in old age, it shrunk, you know, in proportion. But they had two children. The first was Alexander, and he, interestingly, served during the First World War for the Imperial Austro-Hungarian Army. As a quartermaster in the army, perhaps because of the commercial background. This photograph, I believe, would be taken around 1916. The armband is probably in mourning of the death of the Emperor Franz Josef, who died at the end of 1916. And you can see that he's already, by 1916, been decorated with a couple of medals there. Now, he, as I said, served in the army during the war, and ended up becoming a manager within the family business. And he married Margaret, his wife, in Vienna. The second child was Cathy Newman, or her married name was Newman. And Cathy had a very interesting education in Vienna. So she was taught piano by Professor Paul de Cone, who had been a student of Anton Rubinstein, the great Russian pianist. And she became a very talented concert pianist in her own right. Now, she ended up marrying a businessman, Arthur Newman, in 1922, and he was from what had become Czechoslovakia. So I'm sure many of you would realise that at the end of the First World War, Austria had lost the war, the empire was dismembered, and a number of separate nations were formed out of it. And so Kathy's husband, Arthur, came from Czechoslovakia, what became Czechoslovakia. And some of the stories in the family, we were very fortunate in being able to locate the descendants of the family. And some of the family stories indicated that in addition to being a concert pianist, Kathy used to attend lectures by Sigmund Freud, for instance, in Vienna. She was very interested in psychology and things like that. Mentioned the business earlier, the department store. These are some photographs of the department store from the family. It was probably not the largest department store by any means in Vienna, but, a very solid business. The family also manufactured particular items, including what was called hygienic coats, quote unquote, for all professions. Now, the business had been founded back in 1889, and Michael Max had moved to Vienna because back in Hungary, he was one of 9 children. So he'd gone to Vienna for the opportunities. And he obviously made it to Vienna and made good. And the family apparently used to live on the upper story of the building. Later on, another story was added to the building. And the family became fairly prosperous. Some of the stories that we found within the family was of the grandsons remembering going back to the family apartment on a Sunday and having roast goose and lovely cakes and things for lunch. It's also said in the family that the business, the manufacturing part of the business, actually did export some goods to Australia. And in the family tradition, there was apparently a business connection with Myers here in Melbourne. Now, Vienna was a large cosmopolitan city. People from all over the empire flocked to Vienna. And it was the largest Jewish city, had the largest Jewish population of any city in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Around 9 to 10% of the population of Vienna at one point was Jewish. And so it was in many respects, it had at one point in time, it had a reputation for being a fairly liberal city at one point. And it had economically boomed in the 19th century. There were many synagogues, many Jewish associations, educational facilities, that sort of thing in Vienna. But as the 19th century drew to a close and into the early 20th century, a very populist form of anti-Semitism took hold in Vienna. And the standard bearer for that was the mayor of Vienna, Luger, who's pictured on the slide. And it was people like Karl Luger and other overtly racist politicians in Vienna, such as Georg Schonauer, who influenced Hitler in many respects in his anti-Semitism at that sort of turn of the century Austria. And so what you found is as anti-Semitism took hold in things like the city administration, Jewish people became increasingly excluded in a bureaucratic sense. So there's this bureaucratic anti-Semitism implemented. So they're excluded from city departments, positions in banks, academia, this sort of thing. Now, Interestingly, in the Weiss family traditions, there's not a lot of memory of anti-Semitism at this time. We're not sure why that's the case. Perhaps they're somewhat insulated a little bit. Perhaps it's the sort of thing that you sort of suppress too, in your family memory. Equally, perhaps anti-Semitism was something that was so routine and daily that, it was such a lived experience of daily life that you didn't have necessarily in this early time the big events that then form part of the lasting family history. It just becomes a sort of constant that the family unfortunately has to deal with. Now, a major turning point for the Weiss family is in 1938, and Judith alluded to the annexation in her opening remarks, the Anschluss. So on the 12th of March 1938, the German state annexed Austria, and it was greeted in Austria, I think it's reasonable to say, with a large degree of support, but there were elements of the community that had tried, obviously, to prevent it happening as well. Very shortly thereafter, there's immediate violence against Austrian Jewish people in Vienna. It's not to say that this hadn't been building up before that. Prior to the annexation, Austria had been ruled by a right-wing neo-fascist government, and that had continued to increase the anti-Semitic restrictions and things on the Jewish people. So there's a continuum here of this building up and up and up over time. But it reaches this crescendo with the annexation itself. One of the first things the Nazis do in Vienna is to deprive Jews of their civil rights. Jewish judges, for instance, are removed from office, as are any holders of public office. One of the other things that's implemented over time is, again, this segregation in a bureaucratic sense of the Jewish community from the rest of the German community in Austria. And this is the inside pages of the Weiss's passports, and you can see they've been stamped with the red J. Again, administratively, bureaucratically distinguishing the Jewish community from everybody else. Now, this has very sinister overtones when you think about it as well, because, we know what's coming very shortly, and this is prelude to then, being able to round people up and, ultimately begin the Holocaust. Now, interestingly, with this family, so we've got 3 generations in Vienna. So we've got Regine and Michael Max, we've got Kathy and Arthur and their families. And we've got Alexander and his family as well. The first to see the writing on the wall was Arthur. And Arthur was someone who was very politically engaged, even back in Austria. And the way the family put it to me was he was ultimately a businessman. One of the things businessmen do is deal with risk. And he concluded that the risks were getting too high. One of the stories that has passed down in the family in this immediate period after the Anschluss is that Arthur's 2 boys were at school, and then one day the teacher came in a Nazi uniform and then subjected those 2 boys to all sorts of abuse. And the school friends, actually, the boys that had been school friends, joining in. And this is the sort of thing that to Arthur's saying, hey, the risks are getting too high here. And because he was a businessman with wherewithal, he was able to plan for an exit. And they looked around, and he managed to basically say, okay, I'm going to try and go to Australia. And one of the reasons, according to the family, they chose Australia was it was literally as far away as they possibly could get from Europe. Now, interestingly, in our collection, we have their passenger list. So this is the passenger list on the voyage that they came out to Australia on. They came out on a ship called the Oronsay. They bought first class tickets. Now, that in itself, I think, is interesting because obviously one of the things that the Nazis are going to do is basically try and seize Jewish assets. So, you know, buying first class tickets perhaps is a way of spending some of your money before the Nazis can actually get hold of it. And they basically listed there, the family. Now, when they arrived in Australia, they said they were only going to stay for 3 months. So they basically were coming out on tourist visas. So it's something that's quite interesting to note, and we'll see how that plays out shortly. So they arrived, they're going to stay initially for 3 months. Meanwhile, back in Austria, things are just going from worse to worse. By November, on the night of the 9th and 10th of November 1938, one of the most serious pogroms orchestrated by the Nazis is unleashed right across Germany, called Kristallnacht, named after all of the broken glass when all of the Jewish stores and things were attacked. Vienna was one of the worst places for this. And in Vienna, for example, 27 Jewish people were beaten to death. Over 6,000 Jewish residents were arrested. 3,700 were sent to Dachau as a result of that. And Arthur and Kathy and their family, obviously in Australia, but the older generation are still back in Vienna. And of course, as you would do, you would be extremely worried about, well, what's the fate for the older generation back home. Meanwhile, while this is all going on as well, the business is being expropriated by the Nazis. This is a part of the expropriation documents that the family have, which they obtained actually from the Austrian state archives. And the business was confiscated and then sold to two Germans of impeccable Nazi sympathies. This was the pattern. So, you know, there's a danger now. You've lost your business back in Vienna. There's physical attacks going on, you know, other measures soon to come. So within days of Kristallnacht, Arthur applies in Australia to see if he can sponsor his parents-in-law to Australia. And it was interesting, the nomination, because, you know, Arthur himself had only initially come out on a touristic visa. Obviously, he managed to somehow, you know, get himself a different status after he'd arrived in Australia. And now he's in a position where he's trying to sponsor his parents-in-law to Australia. What's also interesting about this is that very shortly after arriving in Australia, Arthur invests with a number of other Jewish business people in a business called AXA, manufacturing in Collingwood. And he does have some significant capital with him. So he's been able to get some significant capital out of Austria himself. And one of the things he does is that he says, basically, if the Australian government allows my parents-in-law to come to Australia, I will guarantee their livelihood in Australia, so they won't be a burden on the Australian government. So this is one of the things that the Australian government at this stage was very concerned about. And it was also said that his parents-in-law would be able to bring out between $4,000 and £5,000 of machinery for the new business. Again, one wonders whether this is a way of trying to, you know, at least salvage something, you know, from the Nazis back in Vienna. As I said, he promised that he would look after them and that sort of thing. And it was approved, actually, which is interesting because you go through these files and lots of these applications are rejected in this era, but it's recommended subject to full-time guarantees. And they'd also had to get a police investigation done, and they were recommended that, it seems like he's doing okay and that he should do well in Australia. And this is the bit about Roland S. Brown was the local Commonwealth Investigation Branch Inspector in Victoria. He did lots of investigations, featured in the last talk too, the ASIO story talk. But he did quite a detailed, investigation into the family. One of the other interesting things was one of Arthur's business partners, Hans Klein, was at this point in Canberra lobbying the Australian government to get certain visas approved. Another one of the business partners, Walter Bondi, interestingly enough, was the brother-in-law of the famous Austrian psychiatrist, Dr. Viktor Frankl. So there's lots of Viennese connections here within the business associations of the family. In many respects, Arthur's very lucky that he gets this permission for his family, because a few months earlier there'd been an international conference at Evian to discuss the plight of Jewish refugees from both Germany and Austria. And I think it's fair to say that the Australian government adopted an extremely harsh approach to the question of admitting Jewish refugees to Australia at the time. Australia's representative at the conference was T.W. White, who was a member of the then Lions government. He was a member for one of the seats here in Melbourne. And he argued that at the conference that, Australia was a nation that was predominantly British, and that it desired to have its migrants come from Britain, and that he had no desire to admit into Australia what he thought was going to become, a group of people that would become a racial problem to the nation. So, Jewish people are European, in an era of white Australia, they're being sort of segregated off as, this potential racial problem. And in effect, what the Australian government does is they don't say, no, we're not going to take any refugees, but they impose fairly strict quotas on how many Jewish refugees can come to Australia. And this was interesting because Stanley Melbourne Bruce, former Prime Minister of Australia, who was at one stage president of the League of Nations, he'd actually proposed that Australia take about 30,000 Jewish refugees over a 3-year period. But this got watered down very, very substantially by the Lions government to a policy where we would accept only 5,000 a year. So half of what Stanley Melbourne Bruce was proposing, of which only 4,000 would be Jewish. And then there's this bizarre category of 1,000 Aryans or non-Aryan Christians. So I can't imagine who these Aryan refugees were. But Australia is very much watering down this policy down to 5,000. And then there's very strict requirements, obviously, there were capital requirements, age requirements, all sorts of things then on top of that to restrict the ability of Jewish refugees to enter the country. And look, as I said, you go through these records in the National Archival Collection and you see on some of them rejected. And we know, from having looked at some of these other stories, that people that were rejected ended up dead. It's very tragic. I've got to say, this is not Australia's shining moment in any way, shape or form. Even this very modest refugee policy elicits a lot of anti-Semitism in the community. When I was preparing this presentation, I was assisted by Angus Davison, who was a student at Monash University. We had him come in on a placement. It was in lockdown, so this was a perfect thing to work on. And we're going through some of these, the response of the Australian community, and we just look. I remember saying to him over a Teams call, some of these attitudes, it's just like what they were fleeing from. It really is not Australia's shining hour in any way, shape or form. Here from one of our records, we've got a telegram addressed to the Minister for External Affairs. It happened to be John McEwen, Blackjack McEwen at this stage. Actually, he wasn't Minister, it says Minister for External Affairs, he's Minister for the Interior, so he had responsibility for immigration. This telegram says, must emphatically protest refugees invading Sydney will destroy the standard of living. Seen in those sorts of terms. Another protest, again directed to the Australian government. Here they're referring to Jewish migrants. I already have one in the factory, and if I employ one also as a salesman, I'm certain that within 6 months I shall be out hawking the goods and the 2 refugees will own the business. The stereotypes here are just shocking. A lady from Sydney saying it's Europe's mess, comparing them with the Chinese. Then look at the last comment. This is what I mean. This is an Australian in Sydney saying this. It's just mind-boggling, really. So let's go back to Michael, Max and Regine. One thing that Canberra has stamped that bit of paper saying approved. It's another to actually get to Australia. And this is where the passport fascinated me, because the passport, and I'll show you some of the stamps in the middle, you have this rather convoluted exit from Europe itself. So, as we'll see in a moment, they have to get visas. Now, by the time the approvals get to them, for whatever reason, the Second World War has actually broken out. So we're into 1939 now. And there's no way they can get a visa to Australia in Vienna or anywhere in Germany because the British Embassy has decamped because of the war. So the visas have to be obtained from Budapest in Hungary, which is a neutral country at this point. Then there's another delay, which we think is down to getting all of the necessary exit visas, because the Nazis have a process where Jews leaving have to get exit visas. And of course, this is another means of fleecing them on the way out. And then once they've got all of the permissions to go from Vienna, they have to head to Italy, which at this point is still a neutral country as well. And then they have to set sail from Genoa. So we'll have a look at this journey now. As I said, they had to obtain their visas to Australia from Vienna, from Budapest, sorry, and this was done by the British Embassy in Budapest. And so they're given visas in November 1939, a telegram confirming the permits had arrived, and these were initially valid for 1 month. So they're given 1 month by the Australian government, basically, to get out to Australia. This is unrealistic, and you can see there's an extensions granted along the way. They're given exit visas, as I said, only on the 20th of January 1940 by the Nazis. They actually, by the time they get out, that extension I mentioned to their visas hadn't actually been granted at this stage. So what's quite interesting is they actually leave Austria with expired visas to Australia. They get down to Genoa and they basically get themselves on a boat. But here's the rub. Their visas to Australia at this point have expired. The extension only comes later. So they can't come to Australia. So at this point, they're having to think, well, where are we going to go? And they end up, if you have a look, destinazione, Shanghai. Does anyone know why they would be going to Shanghai?
Free city.
Free city. Yep, it's one of the few places now left in the world that will allow Jews to enter. So they've got tickets to Shanghai on the other side of the world.
I think there were some sympathetic visa in the Chinese.
The Japanese, interestingly, the Japanese, yes, definitely.
There was a Japanese one.
That's right. There was a Japanese official, So they have to head to Shanghai. Now, interestingly, the brother, Alexander, hasn't got a visa to Australia at all. So he's left, he's come out with the family as far as Genoa, and he's going to go to Shanghai as well, but he doesn't have any form of approval to come to Australia at all. So the family travel by boat to Shanghai. Once they're in Shanghai, that's when the visa to Australia is extended. So somehow Australia actually had some diplomatic presence in China at this point. And they were able to get an extension to their visa to Australia somehow. And you can see it's all annotated at the top there. To make it then to Australia, the trip is via Nagasaki, Manila, and Thursday Island. So you can imagine as I'm going through the passport stamps, I'm thinking, gee, this is a hell of a journey. So that's their final journey down to Australia. Now, as I said, Alexander and his family had no entry permits at all. So they're left in Shanghai. And again, you think this is, that they arrive in Nagasaki in April 1940. Within what? A year and a bit, Japan then enters the war. And so one whole part of the family is now trapped, not in Vienna, but in Shanghai, for the duration of the war. But Michael, Max and Regine get down to Australia. This is arriving in Thursday Island. They're seen by customs. Again, got the passenger list for them coming to Melbourne. And of course, their country of origin, China. Interestingly, they're described as they come through as German, and yet the Nazis have stripped them of all, their citizenship rights. They're stateless, in effect. But legally, the Australians are regarding them as Germans at this point. Now, that in itself is an interesting point. You're going to be arriving in Australia as an enemy alien, but we'll get to that in a moment. This is the visa that the Japanese gave them to transit through, and that's the Japanese, the Kitano Maru, the Japanese ship that they travelled to Australia on. So as I said, when they arrived, they basically arrived as enemy aliens, but Australia did honour the admission. But they had to register when they arrived in Australia. So these are some of the registration documents that they filled in when they arrived in Australia. From a family history perspective, these documents are very, very interesting because it even gives you the last address that they were living in Shanghai. So many leads there that could be followed. Because they were enemy aliens, they were subject to various restrictions from the moment they arrived in Australia. This is from Regine's papers. If you have a look at the top there in red, it's marked refugee, but then interestingly parole signed on a certain date. They basically, the family had to report to the police on regular intervals. Again, the family story is that the family actually resented that greatly. And the whole concept of having to be granted parole. But equally, it is fair to note at this point, there were Austrian and German Jewish refugees being sent to internment camps and being interned with hardcore Nazis in different parts of Australia. Regine's paperwork also actually has a copy of her travel permit, so their movements within Melbourne were restricted. You can see here they could only travel freely within a radius of 15 miles of the GPO for the purpose of shopping and recreation. And that's it. So there are various restrictions there on their movements as enemy aliens. Because the family are enemy aliens, there are all sorts of other restrictions that are placed upon them. One of them is the ability to buy a house. Interestingly, the National Archives holds very few records related to private property, and that's because property is generally a state and local government matter. But under the National Security Land Transfer Regulations passed during the war, the federal government would vet any enemy alien who was trying to buy a property. And interestingly, in our collection, we found an application by Arthur and Kathy to buy a property. When we showed this to the family were absolutely amazed by it because it actually gave them a whole lot of details that they would never have known. They knew they bought the place was in Kew, but you know, the reason they had to say, why are we going to buy this place? And they had to tell the government. And they said, well, it's because Michael Max they'd been staying at a double-storey rental property. And he was in his 80s by this stage, and he'd fallen down the stairs and broken his arm. So they wanted to buy a house that was on one level, for example. They basically had to provide a lot of evidence as to why they were not, subversive types. Including some of the things they adduced in their favour was that Arthur had purchased a certain value of war loans. But Kathy, who I mentioned earlier, was a very talented concert pianist, had begun volunteering her musical abilities and was giving concerts, for war-related causes and things like that. So this sort of evidence that, okay, on paper, we're German, according to the Australian government, but we're not, subversive and that sort of thing. Arthur also, by this stage, had invested in a distillery, and one of the things that he decided to go in for during the war was the manufacture of power alcohol, which was obviously alcohol to power different sorts of equipment and things like that. So that again was seen as something positive on his side. And again, there's all sorts of investigation reports. This one concluded that they were regarded of good character and loyal. Interestingly too, there was some sense of local opinion, and it says there's no strong evidence of a strong feeling against the acquisition of further property in the locality. This is Kew, by the way. This comes from the family. This is the house in Molesworth Street in Kew that they purchased. Now, as I alluded to earlier, not everybody from Austria was as lucky as the Weiss family was, because a number of Jewish people who had made it to Shanghai and then tried to make it to Australia had ended up in internment camps. And here we've got an example of Hans Blau, an Austrian Jewish man. He actually had made it to Singapore, and then the British decided to deport the Jewish refugees from Singapore. They were sent to Australia, and he was interned at Tatura in Victoria. As I said, one of the injustices, I think, in all of this was very much these are people fleeing from Nazi oppression, and yet they're getting sort of caught in this dragnet of, oh, you're German, you must be an enemy alien. And this was something that was very distressing to the Jewish community in Australia. The Jewish community in Australia lobbied very hard to get better treatment, pointing out, for instance, that Germans and Austrians of Jewish descent had been deprived of their nationality, and that they should be treated separately from recognised Germans, in inverted commas.
Did you have a lot of them changed their names?
Yeah, and we get to that. That's in the story too. Yes, the names do change. So let's go to that. One of the interesting responses of Arthur and Kathy in particular to being in Australia was very quickly they sought to assimilate as much as they could. And one way we see this in the official files of the National Archives is the spelling of the surname. And we see it go from Neumann, which is very German, to Newman with a double N, to just Newman with one N. It gradually gets more and more anglicised as it goes along. One of the more interesting twists on this assimilation is that actually Arthur and Kathy both converted to Anglicanism whilst they were in Melbourne. And we asked the family, why would this have happened? And one of their granddaughters, Louise Newman, who's a professor and specialises in trauma of refugees, she thought that partially, was a response to the fact that Anglicans had actually assisted them when they'd arrived as refugees, but also that there is a trauma response in that sort of very fundamental step. As I mentioned, Kathy, once she was in Australia, decided to resume her career as a concert pianist. This comes out of some ABC records at the National Archives, but she gave concerts on ABC radio. She performed at the Melbourne Town Hall and various other venues. She had a dream of actually going on a circuit around Australia and doing concerts on ABC radio across the country. Didn't eventuate, unfortunately, along the way. She had a bit of a mixed reception because her style was regarded as very European. In the 1944, the family was naturalised as British subjects, and this is their naturalisation record from our collection as well. In 1945, Michael Max passed away and he was buried in the Melbourne General Cemetery. Now you've got to remember, he's with his daughter and his daughter's family, but his son and his son's family are still trapped in Shanghai. And Alexander, his response was really interesting. We saw how Arthur saw the writing on the wall really quickly and decided to get out. Alexander found it really hard to accept that he and his family would be targeted by the Nazis. He'd served very proudly in that Austro-Hungarian army, and he thought actually they would be spared. And it was only really, as I said, that Kristallnacht experiences and things that forced the awakening there. But he did it. That family ended up stuck in Shanghai for the duration of the war, which itself was very difficult for them. At the end of the war, the Labor government of the Curtin Labor government is being petitioned by the Jewish community to adopt a policy that is more accepting of Jewish refugees, because there's lots of survivors of the Holocaust emerging from camps and in hiding, and also other places like Shanghai where they've been held up during the war. And there was a limited policy implemented by Arthur Caldwell to accept Holocaust refugees to Australia. And Kathy, as part of that scheme, nominates her family in Shanghai to come to Australia. The family also nominate other relatives. There's a particular relative called Thomas Rona, who later became quite prominent in the Sydney Jewish community. And he was actually, on one branch of the family, the only survivor of the Holocaust in Europe. That policy allows Kathy to apply for Alexander and his family to come to Australia, and then they have all sorts of setbacks. They're granted permission and the visas get lost in the mail between here and Shanghai somehow. Shanghai's chaotic, it's the end of the war. Arthur's very well connected, and he had the Secretary of the Commonwealth Department of Supply and Shipping in Melbourne write to Dr. John Burton, who was the private secretary to Doc Evatt in Canberra, can you do something? And the visas got reissued and sent to Shanghai in the Australian diplomatic bag. So again, Arthur's very clued up and connected here. This other, Alexander and his family only arrive in Melbourne in May 1946. And that's 6 years after they'd sort of been first stranded in Shanghai. And the family knew a lot of hardship and poverty in Shanghai, obviously, during the war. Alexander's family also go down the road of assimilating as best they can. So Weiss quickly becomes white. So they become the White family. They start a small business, a leather goods business here in Melbourne, AJ White and Sons. You can see naturalisations also came through over time. Family tried to maintain connections with their Austrian roots. Some of the stories the grandchildren have told, they had a favourite Viennese restaurant in Melbourne. They managed somehow to bring out a Monopoly set that was from Vienna with all the Viennese streets on it. Interestingly, Arthur had managed to actually get a lot of his household possessions out, so the house was filled with a number of things that had come from Austria. He was lucky he'd come just before things that would all have become impossible. The family does talk about how the influence of being refugees has continued on. As I mentioned, one of the granddaughters, Louise Newman, has specialised in the trauma of asylum seekers. Another grandson, Eugene White, went into the law and took up a lot of human rights advocacy, for example. But despite in the family home and things keeping that tradition up outside, of course, you're trying to assimilate into 1950s white Anglo-Saxon Australia. Regine passed away in 1962, was buried with her husband in the Melbourne General Cemetery. Just to finish up, Austrian Jewish community, there are some very significant legacies in Australia from this community. Just some of the names down the side there, you think all from Austrian Jewish backgrounds. Harry Seidler, the world-famous architect, Peter Singer, the renowned international, ethicist. His story is more harrowing. His parents got out here. His grandparents were rejected, went to a concentration camp. One of them perished. Grandmother eventually came out under that post-war scheme. Dick Klugman, the federal Labor MP, now deceased. Eva Marx. Eva Cox, the pioneering women's rights advocate. Judy Kassab, the artist born in Vienna of a Hungarian background. One of the more interesting ones, and this is just a little insight as an archivist, when I first joined the National Archives 21 years ago, one of my first tasks was descendants migration records, because not all migration records are kept forever. Depends whether people were accepted or not. And I'm going through this box of records, separating out the ones that were accepted from those that aren't. And I'm going through, and there's the documentation for Sir Gustav Nossel's family. And the Nossel family was quite interesting because Sir Gustav's father was Jewish and his mother wasn't. And it was interesting to see how his father's passport had the J on it, but his didn't. And Robert Mann being another prominent figure from an Austrian Jewish background. Around 2,000 Austrian Jewish refugees ended up coming to Australia. So a couple of things. Anyone interested in further research into the Jewish experience in Australia, we have a guide on our website called Safe Haven, which looks at the key series of records in the collection. Just a couple of acknowledgements to wrap up. I'd like to thank the family of the Weiss family, particularly Eugene and Naomi White, who are grandchildren of Alexander, and Louise Newman, who's a granddaughter of Kathy. Sue Hampel at the Monash University, and particularly Monash University for allowing us to get Angus to work with us on this presentation. Royal Historical Society of Victoria, and colleagues at the National Archives. That's it. Happy to take questions.
Just a couple of slides back. When you show the guide that you've got, it's got Malcolm Turnbull.
Different, Malcolm J. I think the Prime Minister's Malcolm B. Yeah, not the same.
Just jumped on it.
I've got one in the book that I wrote about the Schmatters. He's from Vienna, Robert. I forgot his second name. He came out and had the elegance label, but he came from Vienna via Indonesia. He had to get from on a boat from there to here. I think he came without any documentation, and he had just some that his father gave him in Vienna to sell, some patterns and things along Flinders Lane. And anyway, he ended up with another fellow from Vienna opening the Elegance label, Elegance Fashions, in Mallorca House in Flinders Lane. He's in my book, one of the first stories. He was such a lovely man. He was so full, and he told a lot of jokes. I've got the jokes in there too. Yeah.
But you look at that list there and you just think the breadth and the diversity of the backgrounds, academics, professionals, culture, because they're bringing this rich heritage, because Vienna was one of the most elegant, cultured cities in Europe, but sadly descended into absolute barbarism.
He had a beautiful suitcase that he took all his samples around. And no one was interested in the samples, just the lovely suitcase. He told me. Because obviously, as you said, they're really elegant over there. And he took it for granted it was just a bag, but they've not seen anything like it in Melbourne.
Because it's very cosmopolitan, isn't it? It's very,
Does National Archives get a lot of inquiries from people writing histories of these families or groups of families and
Yes.
the Exodus generally, maybe?
Yes. Obviously, for anyone writing a story that involves 20th century migration, we are a go-to place. And we actually, and it ranges on all sorts of levels, from people just doing their own family history, to writing, quite detailed studies and things of particular migrant groups or particular individuals, yes.
some of the quotes we saw, we're hearing the same thing today, to some extent, some of those quotes from 40, 50 years ago, which is a bit alarming.
Jane.
Actually, my question kind of follows on from what Judith just said. Your last slide mentioned just all the people that helped you put together this particular project. How much effort does it take for you as a person who this passport stumbles across your desk to then get everybody else on board to let you create a project like this?
Look, I must say, I have my job is a beautiful job where you can do these things. For me, don't interpret this the wrong way. It's not a lot of effort. I think my partner calls these things passion projects. I just thrive off doing them. It's not a lot of effort, and I think maybe I bring an enthusiasm that's slightly infectious and people come on board.
It helps you with the research too.
It does.
It sends you down all those rabbit holes.
That's right. I think one of the most interesting things is trying to find the family and trying to, because an archive, as much as we're a rich source of information, we are only a partial source of information, particularly a government archive, because our collecting mandate is very defined and we just have certain records to work off. And with many of these talks, and it's the same with the ASIO one, where you can connect with the family, you get this other side of the story. And working with the family here, it was interesting how, as I said, it brought out elements that they would never have had any inkling about. Sometimes you work with these stories and it challenges a little bit as well, some of the family narrative as well. So, but that's part of the journey and that sort of thing. But it's very satisfying when you can bring the family history together with the official record, because I think you get something that's much more richer.
I just say it's not a question, but it's still very hard to get into Australia. So I'm an immigrant.